Thank you, everybody. Thank you especially to the Social Justice Council for this opportunity. I think it is rare that we actually take the time and give space to talk about this incredibly difficult issue. And I really appreciate all of you for coming back or for joining us for the first time today. I want to say before I launch into it that this is part of what the Social Justice Council at St. David's does. We are dedicated to helping the congregation and the community better inform themselves about the social justice issues in the world around us. So if there is a subject matter that you think we as a congregation should engage in, please reach out to the Social Justice Council. Please let us know what your thoughts are, and we promise to take them seriously and do what we can. So, with that being said, this is part 2. So I wanted to start today with a little bit of a refresher and how we ended up at the end of part 1. We cut off our story in 1967, after the end of the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And as I explained at the end of our last talk, the reason that I stopped the story there was primarily because that was the end of the part of the story where the Arab neighbors are on a large-scale level attempting to erase Israel, attempting to deny Israel's reality and wipe them from the face of the earth. After 1967, despite rhetoric, Israel is a reality. And again, despite the rhetoric that will continue to today, all of the Arab states know this. They might not be happy saying it out loud, but they all know that Israel is a settled fact on the ground right now, which changes the way we need to look at the story. Because there is another population there, and the question of whether or not they are a people, the question of whether or not they deserve their own state, begins to dominate the conversation in a way that the Jewish question dominated the first half of the discussion. But let's pick it up in 1967. At the end of the war in 1967, the UN passed another resolution, 242, that established a concept that would be used a few times. It was called Land for Peace. And the idea was relatively simple. Israel had taken land from its Arab neighbors and would trade that land back in exchange for good relations, or if not good relations, not hostile relations. This first and most importantly resulted in the Sinai being returned to Egypt. We'll have to talk about that later, but it's worth pointing out that of the territories occupied during the 1967 war, Sinai is going to be the least important in our story because it goes back pretty quickly. However, the other ones deserve a notation. The Gaza Strip, which was part of Egypt, the West Bank, which was part of Jordan, and the Golan Heights, which were part of Syria, are now all occupied by Israel. Not necessarily owned, but occupied. And that, we're going to get into that distinction because it is a very problematic one. But the populations of those territories are now under military occupation from Israel. And we have to ask the question, what are we going to do with those people? Not to mention the fact that we talked about last time that there were about 600,000-700,000 Palestinians that had fled from the first Arab-Israeli war that are now refugees. They have continued to multiply, they continue to have children, and it's now up to about 1.3 million refugees living in the refugee camps surrounding Israel. And that question is still open. But let's turn briefly to Israel. Because after 1967, yes, Israel exists. It's, I don't want to say safe, but compared to the time period where its neighbors were actively trying to invade it, it is much safer. And yet there is a core problem. There is essentially an identity crisis for Israel that comes down to this very simple notion. Israel wants to be a Jewish democracy. Now that it's taken the occupied territories, it functionally can't be both. To be Jewish, to be a land that is ruled by Jewish laws, that is home to a Jewish majority, that is the place that Jews have been looking for, where they don't need to make excuses for who they are, and they don't need to be a minority to anybody else, a second-class citizen in any definition of that. For Israel to be that, Jews have to be the majority. Now, there's always going to be debate within the Jewish community what Israel means, what Israel stands for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if there's one thing that all Israelis agree upon, it's this: Israel exists as a safe place for Jews to live. Period. I'm serious. When you poll Israelis, they are split on every topic, just like Americans. But that one question, does Israel exist in order to create a safe place for Jews to live? The answer is, well, yeah, of course. That's why Israel is there. So question number one is, Israel is Jewish, but shortly following that, with no comma in between, Israel is a democracy. They believe in democratic values. They believe in one man, one vote. They believe that the majority should rule and that there should be a sense of community decision and not some dictator like every country that surrounds it. It's important to note that the closest thing the Arab world at this point has to a democracy is Lebanon, and that is so broken it's laughable. Sadly, I don't have time to get into that situation right now. Israel wants to be the light of democracy for the region. As a matter of fact, they'd like to be a light of democracy for the whole world, but there's a problem. If they count all of the people in the territories that they have just occupied as new Israeli citizens, Jews will no longer be the majority. They'll be a democracy, but they won't be Jewish. If they don't count the people in the occupied territory as citizens, then they're still Jewish. The Jews still have the majority. But can you really call yourself a democracy? And this core oxymoron, this core conflict is troubling for all Israelis, except for maybe Haredi, who never really is the whole democracy idea to begin with, but so. They're the 3% of Jews that say, actually, we don't really care. Like, Israel exists. We're going to live here anyway. So Israel is torn. Israel continues to be torn since 1967, arguably before that, but definitely since 1967. What does it mean to be Israeli? They desperately want to be good, and they desperately want to be Jewish. Good, in our geopolitical terms nowadays, is democratic. Jewish is not up for debate. We'll see how they decide. I'll let you come to your own mind on that. Meanwhile, the story I told earlier about this is the time where the Arab states stop trying to invade Israel is problematic for the people of the occupied territories and the people in the refugee camps. They have identified as Arab, they identified as Jordanian, they identified as Syrian, they identified as Egyptian, and now they're what? And so here we have the beginnings of the creation of a new identity. Now, I have to be very careful because the word that they're going to use to define themselves, Palestinian, is ancient. There have been people living in Palestine for a very long time. Granted, it hasn't always been called Palestine, but they also haven't always been the people in it. This concept of Palestinian nationhood is relatively new. But if we're going to play that game, so is the concept of nationhood. The concept of nationhood only goes back to about the mid-1800s. The Israelis formed it over the course of our last story. Here, the Palestinians are essentially starting to say, okay, well, that works for the Jews. They created a nationhood that gained them international sympathy, that got them a seat at the table, and we find ourselves without the seat at the table, so we need the same thing. So the Palestinian people is this concept that begins forming to try to fill in the blank of where I've stuttered in my story several times. What do we call these people who are dispossessed? What do we call the people in Israel who don't identify as Israeli? And increasingly, we find ourselves calling them Palestinian. They start calling themselves Palestinian, and an organization forms with that express purpose called the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And the PLO is complicated. We have to start with that. It is complicated. Just like many other civic organizations in the Middle East, the PLO wears a lot of hats. It is, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, their legitimate representative. It is the organization for Palestinian pride. It is often running the refugee camps and eventually parts of the occupied territories for good. It runs hospitals, it runs schools, it runs civic care agencies, it runs old folks' homes, whatever it takes. It is also fighting for Palestinian recognition and against the enemy that helps define what it means to be Palestinian, which is Israel. So they have simultaneously ambulances to care for people and suicide bombers to bring kids. It is split identity, but at the core of both sides of that Janus-like organization, we recognize there is one idea. Palestine deserves to be treated as a nation with all the respect, rights, and privileges of nations in the modern world. And when it's not receiving that, it has a right, if not a responsibility, to fight for itself to get those rights. I'm not trying to justify all of their actions. I'm saying this is how they justify all of their actions. The man behind this, that I'm not going to dive terribly deeply into, but we can't tell this story without naming him, is a gentleman named Yasser Arafat. And Arafat is a lot. He is a politician through and through. He is a freedom fighter when it's necessary. He is a peacemaker when it's necessary. He is a figure of towering involvement, whether that be good or bad. He is a master at being in front of the cameras when necessary. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. There are plenty of leaders in modern world history that master that same talent and we hold up as paradigms. But unfortunately, part of what Yasser Arafat is standing for is the terrorism. So let's talk about that a little bit, because this can't be ignored in our story. The PLO, as well as smaller, less recognized organizations, quickly realized that the ongoing war, as they see it with Israel, has become entirely asymmetric. In case you're not familiar with that term, symmetry in war is a concept of balance. If you think of symmetry, think about the old battle lines, especially during the Napoleonic era. That's what I like to imagine, where you get one army standing in one color and another army standing in another color, and they face each other and kill each other like civilized men. This is our Western ideal of warfare, but to fight that fight and think you have a chance of winning requires some level of at least perceived parity. You have to believe you have a chance of winning to even step on that battlefield. And throughout Western history and Eastern history, if we want to look at it too, when that symmetry, when that parallel does not exist, when one side knows if I step on that battlefield, I'm gonna lose, we resort to asymmetrical warfare, sometimes called guerrilla warfare, sometimes called terrorism, has all sorts of names. But the idea is simple. If you can't fight the enemy on their terms, change the terms. And the Palestinians have done this now for decades, because if the great Arab armies couldn't defeat the Israeli army, what chance do a bunch of refugees have? So groups like the PFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, quickly rise as features within the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And their job is to keep the fight going. Now, I phrased that carefully. There's little belief that terrorism will win the fight. But there is a heck of a lot of belief that if you give up fighting, the war is over. So the job of the PFLP, the job of these other organizations, if you will, is to keep the fight alive. If Yasser Arafat stands for anything, it's probably that. Keep it, well, that and corruption. He was super corrupt. It's to keep the fight alive. So we have, for those of you who remember, all sorts of examples of this. I've got some of the pictures up here. For those who remember the Munich massacre at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, when 11 Israeli athletes were murdered, well, taken hostage and then murdered. There was the spate of hijackings, especially when flights were flown to Jordan and then held in the desert. This was all an attempt to keep the Palestinian story as close to the front page as it could. Without the story, what's the point? And then, of course, we have other ones like the more modern suicide bombings, which we'll talk a little bit about later. I do want to note, this is a widespread story, but the part of the story that doesn't get told enough is the impact on the neighboring Arab countries, especially the countries that were hosting the refugee camps. Best understood among those is Jordan, which found itself in the early 1970s with 60% of its population being Palestinian refugees. Literally, the supermajority of the country was not citizens of the country. They were people who wanted to be somewhere else. And that very quickly led to conflict. That 60% of Jordan started to say, hey, why is there even a Jordan? It should be ours. We're the majority. We should be running this, which led to basically a civil war between the Jordanians and the Palestinian refugees. It was known as Black September. It was ugly. The whole world was cringing as both the US and the Soviet Union considered, how do we get involved in this? Long story short, the Jordanians won, but it was uneasy. And now you've got a very contentious relationship between the refugees and their host countries. Now the host countries look at the refugees as troublemakers. And that's going to continue. There are going to be numerous instances that I don't have time to get into right now, where Israel will feel the need to either attack or invade neighboring countries because of some, pardon me, crap that the refugees pulled. And I shouldn't even say the refugees. Crap that terrorists representing the refugees pulled. So, meanwhile, as we talk about the people who have been forced out, there's another group that has to be part of our story. From very early days, there was an extremist branch, bless you, there was an extremist branch of the Zionist movement that said that Israel should be all of the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Minority group. Not a very popular opinion, especially for those Israelis who are very happy after 1967 that the wars are over. But there is still a group saying, this isn't done. And one of the tactics that they choose to continue their fight is to move. We call them settlers, they call themselves settlers. They move into the occupied territories, primarily the West Bank, although in very small numbers into Gaza. And they set up homes. This is illegal. By all law, by Israeli law, by international law, by human code of ethics, it is illegal. They are moving into places where they have no rights, staking a claim and demanding that their rights be protected. And that last bit is actually the key. It is essentially a game of nationalist chicken that they start playing with the Israeli government. The settlers move into areas that they're not allowed to move. And then they get attacked by the locals. And they turn to the Israeli government and they say, hey, devout Jews here being attacked by Palestinians, you gonna let this happen? You really want news stories of you abandoning fellow Israelis? And with a very small number of exceptions, the Israeli government always wins. They always play the political game that it is better to protect the settlers than abandon them. There are a few examples of the opposite. There are a few times where Israel will say, no, these settlers, they're going too far, we have to stop this. And so they will bulldoze a couple houses. And they'll do it very publicly and make it seem that Israel is knocking down settlements. But that is the exception that proves the rule. There's less than 1% of the settlers that are going in that face any kind of consequences. And usually it's the ones that are the most obnoxious that the Israelis are apparently, no, we would have knocked down your houses anyways. No. Too far maybe. But the point is that these are the kind of acceptable losses that Israel has decided. But the tide has been that as settlers move in, they create comfortable living spaces for themselves and others follow. As a matter of fact, I've got up here, I know they're very small, but for those who can see, these are very early settlers. It looks almost like homesteading in the West and the US. But down here, I've got some more and more recent settlements. And there's a couple things I want to point out. First off, you should be able to tell from both of these pictures that these settlements are on the top of hills. That was very intentional. They control very important geographic points that mean even if the settlement is small, it has a wide reach. Now, they would probably claim that this is the best land. Think about that argument for a minute. Also, that this is the safest land because nobody could say shoot down into their community, which again is an argument that works both ways. But also, especially this one right here, I know it's very small, I'm sorry. Probably should have made that bigger. These settlements are getting very nice. Some of the settlements are gorgeous. And some of the settlements are receiving things like significant tax breaks from the Israeli government. There are now people, I'm skipping way ahead time-wise right now, but there are now settlers who are moving into these settlements, not because they are extremists who want to push the Israeli agenda forward, but because they're the nicest, cheapest houses around, and the schools are great. And that's a legitimate thing. There are good, common sense Israelis who are not looking to have a fight with any Palestinian, who are choosing to move to the settlement because life is good there. That is an intentional development train that they set up, that these have become such established facts that a family could say, you know what, the risk is the risk, but that's the best house we're going to be able to afford. Let's do it. And you can see here, they are peppered throughout the West Bank. Again, on strategically important hilltops. You might notice here that there are none in Gaza. There was a period in, I want to say it was the 1990s, please don't quote me on that, where Israel decided to remove all of the settlements from Gaza. That was a political move, and if memory serves me right, there were only about, it was like 12 settlements in Gaza at that point. So it's a part of a bigger story that we need to tell. So I'm going to move on from this slide. Unless there are any questions on, I should slow down.
Great.
Yes, please.
Where all the located are the settlements?
Yes.
And they're all in Jordan?
No. Jordan has ceded this territory. It is now occupied territory. After 1967, Jordan no longer owns the West Bank. Nobody does.
Nobody does.
Right, that's where we started, right? This is the occupied. Is it Palestinian? Is it Israeli?
And is that true for Gaza also?
Yes. Yes. Well, Syria has never fully given up on the Golan Heights, but if any of these have been incorporated into Israel fully, it's the Golan Heights.
And when you say occupied, you mean occupied by Israel?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But then there are these extra occupied specific locations that are called settlements.
Correct. Well, those aren't just occupied, those are owned, those are lived in, they're essentially little town fortresses.
Okay, so when you say occupied, you mean territory.
Yes, but we're gonna have to break that down further because there are actually gradations of that, and I've got a map to show you of that. No, kibbutzes are a much older term. Kibbutzes were a pseudo-communist farm. It was a collective where the Jewish kibbutzim, the people who lived there, moved in, and it was run on a collective basis, collective decision making. There are still some kibbutzes, but they are really kind of, those actually fit best in the story in the early days before the creation of the state of Israel, when Jews were purchasing land, started improving, that would eventually become the state of Israel. They're kind of legendary in Israeli history, but now they're mostly like where you send your teenagers to see what it really means to be Israeli for a summer.
Right. Who did, what, you said Jordan gave up
Yes.
that?
Well, I mean, was forced back.
Okay, it was forced out by just the settlement,
No, the Israeli military during the 1967 war.
okay, but that land was given to Jordan after the First World War, correct? Because Jordan fought for it.
After the First World War, it was British.
Yeah. And then Jordan came with love for it, that was my understanding.
Well, Jordan didn't really fully exist at that point, not until the full British withdrawal in 1947. So really Jordan takes the West Bank during the 1948 war.
Okay, that's what.
So 48 to 67 was when that was Jordanian territory.
I have a fuzzy memory, but in some areas it's pretty clear. I have a daughter that was in college on the West Coast from 98 to 2002.
Okay.
And she had a professor that was, that really spoke against, spoke for the Palestinians.
Mhm.
And she and her present husband, they were together there, had a best friend that traveled there. And this made national news. I'm just not sure where it was, but it was Israel trying to occupy something during that time period. And she stood in front of some big bulldozer or something. It made the national news, and they ran her down and killed her.
Sorry.
Well, they still mourn her loss. And do you have any recollection of that? I wrote a letter to the professor that was prompting his students to be so angry. And I chastised him and tried to get my letter printed in the Seattle Times, but they didn't take it.
What was the time period again?
It was, well, she was in school there from 98 to 2002.
Okay, so the incident occurred at some point.
Oh, definitely during that time.
Okay, it sounds like that was probably related to the Second Intifada, which we'll get to.
Okay.
All right, look, that's my cue to keep moving. All right, so in 1978, we have a seminal moment in this story. It's the Camp David Accords. It is a secret meeting between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, the presidents of Egypt and the Prime Minister of Israel, brought together by Jimmy Carter. I can't believe I got the other two names and not that one. Brought together by Jimmy Carter at Camp David, and it was incredibly successful. The two men and their envoys negotiated peace between Israel and Egypt. This is enormous. It is one of the largest Arab states, one of the most important Arab states, agreeing to formally give up the fight against Israel. It is a recognition of what I said was the reality at the end of 67, that you now have to recognize Israel's here. And Sadat said, yeah, this is our new reality, better to work with them than fight them. They also went a little further. They not only negotiated between their two countries, but they negotiated on behalf of the Palestinian people. And they created a framework for peace in the Middle East, which in some tellings of the story was a deal for the Palestinians to get them their own state. But there was a huge problem with this. Nobody asked the Palestinians. There were no Palestinians at Camp David. So they were simply presented with, hey, here's a message from Egypt. We're abandoning you, and here's your peace plan. And I don't think the Palestinians ever really gave the framework any consideration because they were so offended by the way it had been presented. It was dead before, it was dead on arrival. Unfortunately, that isn't the only thing that was killed by the peace process. Yes, Egypt and Israel came to a peace agreement, but a couple years later, dissidents in Egypt assassinated Anwar Sadat, sending a very clear message to Arab leaders that this was too far. It's one thing to stop trying to invade Israel. It's another thing to announce that you've given up. Sadat paid the ultimate price for it, and every other Arab leader on the planet realized maybe peace is bad for me. Good for country, bad for me. But in countries where the rulers are really only concerned about themselves, this is going to be the end of peace treaties for a while. Meanwhile, in Palestine, in the occupied territories, life was hard. Not impossible, but hard. We were in this limbo. It's not Israel, it's not Palestine, it's not Jordan, it's not Egypt, I don't know what it is. And for decades, Israelis had been kind of taking advantage of this situation and really, for the most part, using Palestinians as cheap labor. Palestinians were the maids, the mechanics in the auto shops. They were working the jobs that Israelis didn't necessarily want for themselves. It was a great deal because you could pay them less and send them home at night, and relations were strained, of course, especially every time one of those terrorist groups conducted an attack. And honestly, the Israeli army was establishing a pattern at this point that if the Palestinians acted out, define how you will, Israel would come down on them tenfold. Right? If a Israeli was murdered, then a house would be blown up in Palestine. If a bus was blown up in Egypt, a town would be attacked in Palestine. The idea, it actually is a long-held idea. It goes back, it's formally written by the French during their occupation of Southeast Asia. If you're going to deal with an insurgency, you need to show them that the cost of fighting back is so high that hopefully they'll give it up. You can't try to win their hearts and minds. You have to show them that it's not worth fighting. This is essentially what the Israelis adopted. And in 1987, this tit for a huge tat came to a head. And almost spontaneously, I don't like calling it spontaneously because any good historian knows that there's always causes. But the causes in this case have happened many times and not resulted in an intifada. But this time it does. And an intifada is an uprising. It is a widespread revolt. And it took many different forms. Some of them were violent. Many of them were violent. Not all of them were. There was a general strike by the Palestinians. Hey, you're using us for labor. Well, we're not going to go to our jobs. Let's see what you feel about that. There was a lot of organizations that were using techniques that they had learned from the civil rights movement in America. But there was also widespread violence. And this went back and forth. And unfortunately, at least from a public relations point of view, the Israelis stuck with that policy of if you hurt us a little, we'll hurt you a lot. And so there tended to be pictures showing up in the news of Israeli boys throwing rocks at tanks that were pointing their main gun at the young boys. It doesn't play well in the news. It's also probably worth noting that we're now 40 years removed from the Holocaust. That well of sympathy that the international community felt for the Jews is starting to run lower. It's starting to become slightly more acceptable for the tides of anti-Semitism that never fully go away to become a little bit more apparent. So this becomes an opportunity for international groups that had previously never spoken against Israel to start saying, yeah, those Israelis are going too far, aren't they? But quietly still at this point. It is also a battle mainly between the PLO and the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. And that means that there are going to be extremists. If the middle of the organization is fighting, then extremists are going to fight in an even more extreme way. It's just the way it works. And so there was an organization during the first Intifada that said, you know, the PLO is not doing it. We all know that they're not going to win this fight. They're good at pissing off Israel, but they're not good at defeating Israel. And that's because they don't take it seriously enough. They need to realize that this is not just a political fight for survival. It is a holy war against the Jews. This group was called Hamas. And they're going to be part of our story. Hamas forms, yes, to fight Israel, but let me be clear, Hamas forms because they disagree with what the PLO is doing. It is at its core an internecine fight within the Palestinian movement. So of course Israel is enemy number one, because who else would it be? But realistically, the fighting is mostly going to be between Hamas and Fatah, which is the main political wing of the PLO. Now, the international community becomes very concerned by the Intifada. Remember, this is the last days of the Cold War. We want to see things settle down. We're starting to feel like the world is coming together. So Clinton invites Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat to negotiations after years of Intifada, and they come and they negotiate and they succeed. Okay. They agree. Probably the most important thing that comes out of it, they agree that in order for Israel and Palestine to talk, they have to recognize each other as equals. Now, that's a very loaded statement, but the result of it is that Israel says, okay, if we're going to talk to you face to face and not through intermediaries, we're going to pick the PLO as your representative. Now, the UN had done this decades earlier. But this is finally Israel saying, okay, we will recognize the PLO as the voice of the Palestinian people. You might be wondering why now, but I just explained it. Because now there are other people saying, no, we're the real voice of the Palestinians. So in essence, this is Israel saying, not Hamas, but we'll talk to you guys. And Yasser Arafat is front and center, of course he is. And they agree to start negotiating. And what they negotiate is a phased withdrawal of Israel's occupation from the occupied territories. The agreement was that essentially it would take 3 steps. In the first area, Area A, Israel would withdraw essentially immediately, and the PLO was going to rebrand itself as the PA. The Palestinian Authority would be now recognized as the legitimate government of Palestinians and would rule in Area A. Then, as things progressed, the Israeli army would withdraw from Area B. Now, until that happens, Area B is going to be under a combination of Palestinian Authority and Israeli military rule. We'll get there. And once that's all done, then Israel will complete its withdrawal from Area C. But until then, Area C will be ruled entirely by Israel. And when I say entirely by Israel, I mean by the Israeli military. 100% occupation. If you're paying close attention to this map, you will notice that there are some areas, including right here, that are not A, B, or C. It is worth noting, even in this plan, Israel said, no, there's going to be occupation still in some places. For example, this section here is right along the Dead Sea. And Israel said, we're not leaving that. We don't trust you up against the shore of the Dead Sea. There's going to be a nice thick border area where even once we pull all the way out, we're not pulling all the way out.
Why was that strategic for that? Why did Israel want that particular location?
It's a good question. Some of it has got to be cultural. Some of it might be economic. But for whatever reason, they were willing to dig their heels in. A lot of the places here, an easier answer to your question, are water aquifers, water resources. Israel made sure that they still controlled the access to the water point. By the time it gets down to the Dead Sea, that's not really the best water, so I'm not sure I'm willing to extend that there. But yeah, water is a key. So you have to understand, the plan of this map was steady Israeli withdrawal, and the reason we're talking steady is because not everything was decided. For example, who gets Jerusalem? More importantly, who gets the privilege and the responsibility of protecting the holy sites in Jerusalem? That is an incredibly complicated question, one that I've avoided. Because it is despite the fact it lives at the heart of this issue, it is actually tangential to all politics. Let's give you just a 1-minute version of it. The Temple of David, the holiest site in all of Judaism, was set up like an onion with layers. Each of the layers a different population was excluded from, so that by the time you got to the center of the temple, only the high priests were allowed. And when you get to the Holy of Holies, the very, very center, it was only the high priest who was allowed behind the shroud twice a year. Right? This is how sacred, and this is a religious group. We all know why you can't go in there, right? Who's in the Holy of Holies? God, of course. The most important place on the planet for Jews. That they got kicked out of, and about 1,000 years later, well, 800 years later, Muslims showed up. They had adopted the Jewish stories. They had adopted the Jewish Bible. They had incorporated it into their meaning. And in order to prove the importance of a few things that I don't have time to talk about right now, Muhammad told the story of an angel carrying him to Jerusalem and setting him on a rock and showing him the city of God and saying, look, this is the kingdom of God on earth, and then raising him from that rock to heaven and saying, this is the kingdom of God in heaven. So when Muslim invaders got to Jerusalem, they went to that rock and they built the third most important mosque in all of Islam on top of that rock, because that rock symbolized the place where God had trusted Muhammad to see heaven. But Muhammad had selected that rock as the place to tell his story, because that rock was the place where, as the Ghostbusters would put it, the veil was thin. Because that was the Holy of Holies. That was the place that Judaism had said God resided. So of course, that's the place that Muhammad met heaven. Of course. It was actually, if anything, a respectful story to Judaism to use their story. But if we want to talk about who gets the Temple Mount, you cannot build a new temple without destroying the Dome of the Rock. It cannot be done. If Jews believe that the only people who should be in the Holy of Holies are the high priest twice a year, what are you going to do with the third most important place on the planet to the second largest religion on the planet? It's an impossible question. I don't have the answer to it. They don't have the answer to it. So at the time they said, okay, we'll figure this out later. Let's work on withdrawing Israeli troops and we'll talk about that later. Also, speaking of impossible questions, what about the right of return? After the 1948 war, when 742,000 Arabs had fled from the land and become refugees, the UN said that they had a guaranteed right to return to their homes. Here we are, 50 years later. Their homes aren't there anymore. Or if their homes are there, they've been occupied by Israelis, literally occupied, not military, like literally, like families growing up generation after generation in their homes, to the point now where whose home is it really? The one that's been living there for the last half century, or the one that lived there for the 2 centuries before it? Not to mention the fact most of those homes don't exist anymore. By plan, many of them were bulldozed and housing developments were made on top of them. So it's not just a question of, can this Arab family return to their ancestral home, but are you going to displace the 100 Israeli families that live in an apartment building on top of where their home used to be to give them their land back? Seemed like the temple was an impossible question, but it turns out the right of return might be harder. So they also said we're going to talk about it right now. We'll figure that out later. Unfortunately, later got complicated. Just as with Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin faced punishment from his own people for being willing to talk peace. Ultra-conservative groups within Israel were furious about this plan that recognized Palestinians had a right to statehood, and so they assassinated. Once again, the message is clear to leaders. You can talk peace carefully, but actually making it, you're going to pay the price. I'd like to believe that all political leaders are altruistic, but I've met some of them. The peace process did continue, but in fits and spurts. And groups like Hamas weren't happy with this plan either. Just as radical Israelis said we want the whole land, Hamas said we want the whole land. So Hamas saw this as, hey, the PLO is getting a little too close to success on their terms. And they started blowing up buses, which upset Israelis. Those same Israelis who were shocked and revolted by the assassination of the prime minister started to fear more for stepping onto the bus. By the way, sorry to keep going out on tangents. The reason that buses were the one of the favorite targets of the Palestinian terrorist groups was because the bus system was designed by Israel to transport the military. Soldiers in the IDF ride on the buses for free. And in a case of emergency, the buses would immediately kind of revert to military. They would be basically the troop transports around the country. So, climbing onto a public bus not only was a way of spreading fear within the general populace, but also pretty much guaranteed that there would be some military targets readily there. So it was seen as kind of a fair game target that also happened to scare the general populace. Yeah, ma'am.
What was in the middle of that picture, in between the?
The remains of the bus.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah. 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 So in this hornet's nest, we see the rise of an Israeli politician that is just as important as Yasser Arafat was to introduce. His name is Benjamin Netanyahu. You've heard his name, I'm sure. From this point on, he's on and off the Prime Minister of Israel till now. Netanyahu is an interesting figure. He is the first Prime Minister of Israel that was not part of the founding generation. That is vitally important. Before him, there was this core that had a concept of what it means to be Israeli that included negotiation and proving that Israel had a right to exist. Netanyahu comes in with much more of a militant concept of course we have the right to exist, and anybody who says otherwise should feel our wrath. Interestingly, the first American president who was not part of the founding generation was Andrew Jackson, and we had a very similar kind of watershed turn for our politics there. I don't want to take that too far, but Netanyahu represents a new way of Israelis seeing themselves. And it is his message, then as much as it is today, is Bibi Netanyahu will keep you safe. When that's happening, far too often, the message of I'll keep you safe is incredibly appealing. So even though he was blamed for Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, even by Rabin's widow, he was blamed for it, for riling up the factions that were radical. He ends up winning the next election because of the bombings. So we end up with this at the turn of the millennium, very messy, uncomfortable period. Peace is still being attempted, but factions, both among the Palestinians and among the Israelis that are not interested in peace, are fighting to knock it down. Arguably, Ariel Sharon is one of those people. Ariel Sharon is a war hero to Israelis and a war criminal to Palestinians. He is blamed for some massacres that happened, especially in Lebanon, during one of Israel's many invasions of Lebanon. He is considered by Palestinians one of the most revolting figures in Israeli history. And he decided in 2000, I think it was, in 2001, to go visit the Temple Mount, which is just incredibly provocative. Here's the thing though, it was a matchbox ready to be lit anyways. It was a tinderbox ready to explode. Yeah, Sharon should not get all of the blame, but he knew what he was doing. This became a rallying cry as well as an Israeli military killing of a young Palestinian boy, and we have 7th Intifada. Once again, the Palestinian population rises up somewhat as a whole. Once again, there are plenty of peaceful protests and plenty of violent protests. We see tactics like Israel is now sending out armored bulldozers. And if Palestinians blow up a bus, Israelis roll the bulldozers in and bulldoze a block. This, I believe, is,
Yes, that's
What-
what.
yeah. It is asymmetry in the worst possible way. Yes, sir, please.
Right. Hope I don't throw you off the question, but do you see a connection between the second intifada and 9/11?
I'm sorry?
Do you see any connection between the second intifada and September 2001?
No. No, not at first, because the second intifada precedes 9/11. However, so the rumblings of the launch happened first, but then, when 9/11 happens, that's when we see the pictures of Palestinians celebrating 9/11 in the streets. Because as far as they were concerned, the Israeli military that they were in the process of fighting was using American training, using American weapons, using American money. So, the Americans got hit too.
I guess that was the root of the question. Was it a cause and effect thing where?
No, the only connection between the two is that they happen to concur. Yeah, and 9/11 would have to be a whole nother discussion. The motivations behind it actually have absolutely nothing to do with Israel Palestine.
Thank you.
But the Palestinians did make that connection in their mind, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yeah. We'll keep going, because I know I've been talking a lot, and I want to give people a chance to enjoy their Sunday. Okay. Shortly after the second intifada winds down, Palestine is going to have an election. This was a way of trying to revitalize things. This is only the second election in Palestinian history. The first one was right after the Oslo Accords, where people weren't entirely sure, and there was only really one party that was up for consideration. Now, Fatah has been in power for a decade. And as I already noted, Yasser Arafat, the leader of Fatah, is as corrupt as they come. He's Arab. I'm sorry. I have lived with the Arabs. I love them dearly, but Arab politics and corruption are hard to distinguish. That's a very loaded statement that I'd love to unpack, but not right now. The number one concern for Palestinians in this election is corruption. Go figure. They're not, this is not an election about Israel. Does Israel play into the rhetoric of both parties? Of course, how could it not? Yeah. But the core, the motivating factor for the overwhelming majority of people going to the polls was corruption. It was what was really affecting their lives. Were the Israelis sometimes rolling in and bulldozing a neighborhood? Sure, but corruption was making everything harder every single day. And so they voted for the anti-corruption party, which was the party that was not in power, which was Hamas. They were not voting for Hamas because they believed Hamas that this was a religious war. I'm sure a couple of them did. They voted for Hamas because Hamas promised to clean up the corruption. That was their sales pitch. That's what their signs were all about. We will end the corruption. And so the Palestinian people said, sure, give it a shot. And the international community said, wait, what? But they're a terrorist group, which is true and isn't. Just like the PLO, Hamas is both a terrorist group and a civic organization. They don't differentiate between the two. They have different branches. So the international community flipped out when a terrorist organization won the election. And this is the post 9/11 world. And so very quickly, this election victory for Hamas turned into a civil war in the occupied territories. I'm not exaggerating with that phrase. It was a shooting war between Hamas and Fatah, and the international community as a whole supported Fatah. because they haven't done terrorist stuff as much lately. The result was a split. Fatah managed to hold on to the West Bank, which is where most of the Palestinians are. It's where most of the world's attention was. So we, America and Israel and others made sure that Fatah held control of the West Bank. Were the people in the West Bank happy about that? Not as much, but fine. At least they're not shooting at each other anymore. But Gaza was given to Hamas. And Netanyahu's back. He bounces in and out. Netanyahu's back and he's got a new strategy, and the 2006 election plays a vital role in his strategy. Netanyahu's message is and always will be, I will keep you safe. Here's how he's going to do it from this point on. Number one, he's going to focus on physical separation. Ever since, well, honestly, the first Intifada, but especially the second Intifada, Israel began building defenses in between Israel and the occupied territories. Those accelerate into what we now call the border wall or the border fence, which is a physical barrier between the occupied territory and Israel proper. You can see why this would be popular for Israelis. When the fence/wall went up, bus bombings went way down. Terrorist attacks plummeted. That's a good thing for Israelis. But it had a side effect that is important for us. Nowadays, your average Israeli does not know any Palestinians. And your average Palestinian does not know any Israelis. Remember what I described when I talked about the first Intifada, that the Palestinians were working in Israeli homes. They were working in Israeli businesses. They ran the corner shop that Israelis went to get a soda on the way home from school. They knew each other. They might not be happy with one another, but they knew each other. When the border wall goes up, that stops. Are Israelis safe? Yeah. On average, it's one of the safest countries in the world, thanks to Netanyahu. But they don't know each other anymore. Political division was the second goal of this. And here we're talking about a political division within the Palestinian people. The idea was simple: exploit the fight between Fatah and Hamas, because the longer they're fighting each other, the less they're fighting Israelis. So if that meant looking the other way when foreign terrorist groups or foreign governments were sending weapons to Hamas, well, that's just the price of doing business. Let's be honest. Gaza had been turned into an open-air prison. It was run by Hamas, but there were no jobs there. The unemployment rate at points hit 60%. If Arab governments want to make themselves feel better by sending weapons to Hamas that they can't use because they're trapped, fine. Let them waste their time and energy. Let them fight with Fatah. And we'll just keep building walls. We'll build drone surveillance. We'll build a network of intelligence so that we can do things like ping their cell phones and make them blow up in the middle of the night. This was the idea: divide and conquer. And that conquer is really perhaps the most important point. Netanyahu increasingly is openly in favor of, let's make sure a two-state solution is impossible. Whether that be continuing to support or fund the settlers that are making Swiss cheese out of the map of the West Bank, whether it be just making the Palestinian cause so hated on the world stage, that nobody's willing to listen when they ask the UN for recognition, whatever it might be, let's make it so that the rest of the world says, I might support Palestine, but that's never gonna happen. Let's talk one state solution. And again, going back to what I said way too long ago now, I'm sorry I'm running on for so long. If you're gonna create one state, you run into that Jewish democracy problem. So is there a way we can make one state that the Arabs don't want to live in? Well, that's the ideal. At least in Netanyahu's plan. All right. Then October 7th. 2 years ago, Hamas launched the worst terrorist attack in Israeli history. Essentially, in the very early hours of the morning of October 7th, they broke out. They had spent that quiet period where Netanyahu believed that he was bottling them up, planting spies in Israeli forces, cracking Israeli codes so that they could break out and wreak havoc. And that's exactly what they did. They broke out of the open air prison that was Gaza, and they just rampaged. And if you think about that for a second, the question ought to be why? For Israelis, the answer was obvious. Just look at what Hamas says. Hamas says in their founding paperwork that they want to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. So clearly, this is their attempt to do that. And there is some truth to that. However, Hamas knew they couldn't win. This was not an attempt to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. That would have been impossible. And they knew it very well. If you actually look at what they did, their goal was twofold. Number one, to cause an incredible amount of pain and suffering. And then once you've done that, grab some hostages and beat it back to Gaza. Turns out, the reason that Hamas did this is also twofold. Number one, they needed the world to remember that Palestine was still a thing. We were starting to forget. What's the evidence of that? The Abraham Accords. Donald Trump had worked with Israel and other Arab countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Morocco, to sign peace treaties with Israel. Once again, the Palestinians saw more of their allies abandoning them. There was more and more and more talk about a Saudi peace deal with Israel. And while the Saudis are not the biggest military force, they were a great funder for the Palestinians. And the Palestinians realized that geopolitically things were turning against them. So they needed to shock the world system. Why take the hostages? That lets you drag it out. They saw that Israel was not thrilled to go into the rat's nest that they had made Gaza, so they thought that they could turn their open air prison into a fortress and drag this story out, capture the world's attention, and make them see what Israel was doing to the occupied territories. What they did was horrific. What they did was beyond gruesome. It was inhumane. It was with genocidal intent. But it was also, in its own weird, screwed up way, a cry for help. The response we all know. It was the Israeli invasion of Gaza, which we've all seen. This pattern that I told you about, that if a Palestinian murders an Israeli, Israel bulldozes a block. Well, they just murdered 1,200 Israelis. The response is to bulldoze Gaza. And that's what they've spent the last 2 years doing.
And how many Gazans have been killed?
About 67,000 is the estimate. Now, the numbers for that are challenging. The best organizations situated to give numbers for that are run by Hamas. Because of what I said earlier, right? It's both a civic organization and a terrorist group. We don't tend to differentiate, they do, but that does mean that the best numbers we have available are from the people who have every reason in the world to inflate those numbers.
But it can't be that far off the mark.
I tend to agree with you because war is hell. And when you do that, I don't know how the numbers aren't massive. There's 2.2 million people trapped in a war zone 2 times the size of Washington, D.C. I don't know how the numbers are not perhaps much higher than that. And there have been some estimates that they are significantly higher. Of course, the Israeli estimates are significantly lower. This to me is a reasonable middle point. I have a couple other stats up here for you to consider. Right now, about 92% of residential buildings are either damaged or destroyed in Gaza. 89% of the water and sanitation infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. 92% of the schools need to be rebuilt. And in one thing that is going to be problematic, 62% of Gazans have lost their legal proof of property ownership. Whether it was lost in a bombing, when they had to flee, whatever it might be, there seems to be an intentional approach of erasing evidence that they own this land. And when you consider where that fits in the grander scheme of things, it is very troubling. So, last slide I promise. Where does that leave us? Well, we have a peace deal that has been tentatively agreed to by both sides as of a couple of days ago. I keep checking my phone, waiting to see, are the final hostages finally released? It should be within the next couple of hours. Huzzah. However, a peace deal in the war in Gaza does not change anything that I just talked about. Right. And the big questions remain the big questions. Will the Palestinians get a state? Who controls Jerusalem? Can the refugees come home? And of course, the biggest question of all, who will keep the people safe? Palestinians want to be kept safe by their own people. The Israelis want to be kept safe by their own people. Nobody outside of those peoples wants to be put in the middle. I don't have answers to these questions. Nobody does yet. Yes, ma'am.
What about genocidal intent?
What about it?
Netanyahu has been accused of having that intent.
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
I think it's worth noting that genocidal intent has been clearly stated on both sides of the equation. However, we're talking about an asymmetrical war here, where one side has the capacity to actually accomplish the goal, and one side has rhetoric. And I think that that difference is vital. Not that that excuses the rhetoric. At first, genocide is inappropriate for any person, any group, at any point in human history. However, I think we need to take more seriously the side that has the capacity to do it when there's.
Which side is that?
Israel.
I know, I just wanted to hear you say.
I'm not a politician, I can say it. Israel has the capacity, and important figures in the Israeli government and the Israeli decision-making structure have unequivocally stated a desire for it and not been punished for those statements. I will agree with the organizations that say that this is genocide in future. Yes, sir.
Couple of comments. I heard a commentary on the radio where someone said that essentially Hamas has lost in giving up hostages, any leverage they had because they had the hostages. So they're kind of in a position of no way to negotiate anything based on that. Secondly, there's a lot of rising anti-Semitism globally.
Yeah.
And there's, I personally have a concern for what, if you look at it from the biblical perspective, are we taking steps toward some future annihilation, or attempt to annihilate Israel? And
Right.
essentially.
Yeah, so if I may, let me take those separately. I think Hamas has lost all leverage. The only reason they would agree to give up the hostages is because they know that.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Israel's stated goal is to destroy Hamas, and they may accomplish that goal. But it doesn't matter anymore. Another organization will come back, seeking revenge, making the same arguments that Hamas was making, and they will find even more fertile ground for those arguments because of the damage that has been done. Until there is a viable path to a Palestinian statehood that gives the Palestinians the ability to be safe and to be employed, there will continue to be efforts that to rally people around hate and around violence. Desperation leads people to that. Victimization leads people to that. So if not Hamas, then I just wonder who next, right? When we took out Al Jazeera, ISIS, excuse me, sorry, Al Qaeda, ISIS arose in its place. When we took out ISIS, Al Qaeda came right back. It's whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Because you can't win this with a pure military approach.
Sure.
As far as the second half of what you were saying, you're absolutely right. Anti-Semitism not only has been on the rise, it has been on the rise for a long time. I will go to my grave arguing that the Holocaust did not end anti-Semitism. It simply made it uncool for a little while. We clearly are living in a world where the shame of being anti-Semitic is dwindling. And those forces of anti-Semitism that infect societies and have infected societies for hundreds of years are returning to power. And it is terrifying, and we should do everything in our power to stand with and protect our Jewish brothers, sisters, neighbors, whoever it might be. However, we need to be clear that disagreeing with Israeli politics is not the same as anti-Semitism.
Right.
And until we can disconnect it and say that every Jew on the planet deserves to be safe, deserves to live a good life, to take care of their family, to realize their potential as a human being, and that should not abrogate the same things for Palestinians. That's where we need to get, and we're not there right now, but we can't do the half measures. We can't say that Jews will only get protected when Palestinians are, just like we can't say that Palestinians will only get protected when Jews are. And honestly, that's the game that Netanyahu is trying to play right now. He's trying to say, we will get to the Palestinian concerns when all Israeli concerns are allayed. It has to be both at the same time.
Right.
Yes.
Broaden your perspective of Netanyahu.
Okay.
So, politician persona,
Absolutely.
in negotiation and in what the UN certain countries are doing it,
Yep.
in regards to Palestine.
Mhm.
Does that, in your mind, alter any of Netanyahu's purpose?
I have a theory of national leaders that they set the center. If you think of the national discourse as a spectrum, where there's going to be extremists on both sides, and there's going to be concerns when we get to extreme in any direction. The national leader that we pick, whether we like it or not, establishes where the center of that discussion is. So if a national leader takes a relatively extremist position, that's going to push the extreme to that side out into the danger zone. And I think that we need to recognize that leaders have to own that. They have to recognize when to pull back the rhetoric, to be the moderating voice, so that the extreme doesn't get pushed further and further out. And unfortunately, as you said, Netanyahu is a politician, he's a political creature who is fighting for his political survival in Israel, and frankly, has lost the support of many Israelis, to the point now where he's essentially lost the liberal side of the country irrevocably. At least it seems like they're never going to come back to him. And in order to stay in power, he has gone further and further and further towards the ultra conservatives. I understand that on a human level. I understand that on a I don't want to end up in prison for all the corrupt things that I've done level. But as the leader of a country, he needs, in my opinion, he needs to be bigger than himself. And as you've heard me say, many accusations on the same level can be bridged at the Arab leaders surrounding, who should have been pulling back the anti-Semitic rhetoric for generations, but it benefited them personally to do so. And I think, unfortunately, Netanyahu has crossed too many lines that now the extremists, that some of them he's put in his cabinet, are making the violence a reality. And I think I'm responsible for that. Even though I understand why he's there, at some point you have to say what is good for humanity is better, or is more important than what is good for me. And he's never done that.
We see protests, on television, of course, of what's going on in Israel, the protests against
Sure.
the regime. When are there elections? You know, when are elections are?
So the system is a little different than ours. Elections can be called by the prime minister, elections can be forced by the Knesset. It's not as much of a scheduled election thing. I believe, and I'm going to give myself on a little bit shaky ground here. I believe that the way the Israeli constitution is written, if no elections are called, they need to be every 5 years. But typically, and Netanyahu's been an absolute master of this, he calls an election when there is a news story that swings support to his side, whether that be an attack on the country where people are feeling, hey, Bibi's got to keep us safe, whether it be manufacturing something like the attacks on Iran to gin up, hey, we've got bigger enemies here, let's go to Netanyahu for safety. And that kind of resets the clock. So I'm not sure when the next election is going to be. A lot of it depends on when he feels comfortable calling them, or if he does something so bad, which doesn't look likely right now, that the Knesset undermines the basically his cabinet resigns en masse and forces the elections. I don't think that's very likely right now, especially with the peace plan that is currently being attempted.
But
I have no personal faith that it's gonna, I don't know why recent history would lead us to believe it does, but I remain hopeful that the first steps do, and we can get the innocents, well, the hostages. Sure, but they still deserve to be free.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Doesn't it seem like in history, all of trouble starts when we start to tie religion to statehood?
I couldn't.
All the
disagree
wars
more.
throughout history have been fought, and they say they want to be a democracy, but doesn't that include freedom of religion?
I don't think this is about religion at all.
Really?
I really don't. I believe that religion is an excuse we use to do the things we wanted to do in lives. And we read holy texts and we tell each other the segments of scripture that support the points that we had already come to on our own. This started because two peoples felt that they had been poorly treated throughout centuries.
Yeah.
And wanted a place where they didn't have to answer to anyone else. And unfortunately, they were both promised the exact same spot by the British. And no, we can say by Arthur Balfour and McMahon. Yeah, no, it's very clear who made these promises. And, you know, that was 100 years ago, which in the grand scheme of politics is not that much time. So we're still trying to figure out which of these people get to be saved. And I hope we can get to the point where the answer is both of them.
Same.
Yes, ma'am. You know,
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you think once they use the hostages, it's just gonna stop?
Yes.
I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I don't know.
Or if they do?
I think there are a lot of factors that are involved with that. I think the odds that a group of young angry men in Gaza will do something stupid is almost 100%. And the odds that the Netanyahu regime will use that as an excuse to return to square one is almost 100%. But hope springs eternal. Is it?
Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
I'm sorry.
Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Well, and even if we get to a relative peace in Gaza, we have to address the West Bank, where most Palestinians live.
And they're not allowed to go into the old city too.
It is complicated. They can get passes to do so, but those passes can be revoked at will. Israel has established legal precedents in their country where they can detain anybody, but especially any Palestinian, without habeas corpus. So it is very tense. Are there Palestinians that can work in Jerusalem and in the Israel proper? Yes, but that is always a very shaky yes.
Don't you think when they release the 2,000 prisoners they've been holding? If they're angry men, they could start out again.
I don't see there's any reason to believe that the people who are in prison are any angrier than their families at home. And I think that some of them will be very happy to be back with their families and not want to do that again. And many of them, including many people who were never sent to prison, will be angry that they ever were sent. The 2,000 prisoners being held is kind of a fake number. Israel has been holding thousands for decades. Who we decide to include in these prisoner swaps is always a political question.
And the other question is, who's gonna pay to rebuild the housing that's been destroyed in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are decent answers to that, honestly. It is still entirely feasible for Arab regimes to gain political points by supporting the Palestinians. Right now, Trump has put himself in a position where he can play the good guy by directing money towards it, and frankly, other regimes can step in to curry favors with the Trump regime by doing that. As a matter of fact, one of the more brilliant things that the Trump regime has done in this case is make it more about religion, where they have pulled in the Muslim world to say, hey, are you really gonna let the Palestinians be treated like this? And now we're hearing from countries that are not Arab at all, but are suddenly seeing like, hey, if I send money or maybe even peacekeepers to this, I can get Trump on my side, and we all know that means you get other stuff later, hopefully, right, tit for tat. Well, you know, say what you want about quid pro quo and corruption. This is a way that international diplomacy works, and so we get countries like Indonesia, the second largest Muslim country in the world, that is starting to do the math and say, yeah, we'll help out in Palestine to get Trump happy with us. And that's not a bad thing. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.